Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Khosrau and Anushirawan, Like Father, Like Son, Part 1 by Extra History. Yes, so this is some more Persian history. I don't know too much about Khosrau. I know he was a great a great Sassanid emperor, one of the greatest in fact. I'm very excited to learn about his exploits. The very little I do know about him is what I know in relation to the Byzantine Empire. That's true for a lot of my knowledge of Iranian history. So yeah, this is another one for all my fans of Iranian history. I know there's a lot of you out there. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out channel memberships or the Patreon, where you can get exclusive reaction content, including Historia Civilis reactions and more upcoming Persian history. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
To tell the story of Khosrau Anushirawan, ruler of a golden age, we first have to understand his father, Kavad.
Kavad. Now that is a name I recognize. I really couldn't tell you anything about the guy, but with my unfamiliarity with Persian history broadly, just the fact that I know his name tells you he was probably pretty important.
Kavad ruled the great empire of Iran. The West called it Persia.
Yeah, it's my understanding that Iran is the name, given to it by Iranians, versus Persia is the name given to it from an outside context. So I guess in that sense, Iran would be the more genuine term, but I think they're basically interchangeable. I use Iran and Persia interchangeably.
And he saw that empire brought to the brink of collapse.
Uh-oh.
And boy, oh boy, did he not enjoy that experience.
Well, it was a pretty damn large, impressive empire. My point of reference, as I mentioned in the intro, is the Byzantine Empire, which was also a very large, powerful empire that spanned a massive amount of territory, and it had its ups and downs as well. Both of these empires would at times be extremely powerful, and at times almost be brought to their knees. Of course, both of them would eventually disappear, but there would be points throughout their history at which they really could have crumbled, but didn't.
Prince Kavad spent his childhood like most young boys do, held hostage by his father's greatest enemy. His captors were the Hephthalites, a Central Asian tribe that had pushed their way up to the borders of Iran. They were new.
They're eating up a lot of territory that at the biggest extent of Sassanid territory, the Sassanids held.
They were powerful, and they had made the Iranians very, very nervous. Their relationship had started so well, though. They had helped Kavad's father win his throne. They had fought at his side in a couple of wars. But then they got into an argument over who controlled a town on their shared border. Naturally, Kavad's father had gone to war over it, and he had lost. He had lost so badly that the Hephthalites actually took him captive, and he'd had to pay his own ransom just so he could go back to ruling Iran again.
Yeah, that's a pretty embarrassing position to be in. We see examples throughout history. They are pretty rare, but we do see examples of powerful emperors or kings taken prisoner who have to then be ransomed. It's a pretty humiliating thing to happen if you're supposed to be this sort of all-powerful figure at the head of a powerful kingdom or a powerful empire, to then be taken prisoner and have to literally pay your own ransom, or have your lords or your family pay your ransom.
He was a little testy about that, and so of course he went to war with them a second time, and he lost again. This time, he was forced to give them Kavad as a hostage, because surely he wouldn't attack them again if they held his son.
And, this is not a super uncommon thing. Honestly, throughout history, ancient history, I know this happened a lot in medieval European history, giving up one of your children to an enemy who has some sort of advantage over you. Maybe they've just beaten you in a war, and of course the idea is now they hold leverage. They literally have your child. If that child is your heir, that's an even bigger deal. They're going to hold that over you. The idea is that, maybe you won't want to go back to war if they have your kid. And also, if Kavad or whatever royal child, royal heir is growing up in captivity, the idea is that the captors can indoctrinate him, educate him in the ways of their culture, And then when this child goes back to rule his empire as an adult, he'll be a lot more friendly to them. That was the idea in this pretty common practice.
He did, though. I mean, third time's the charm, right? And he didn't get captured this time. He got killed, along with the rest of the Iranian army. The Hephthalites pushed forward, and the Iranians were in a panic. Kavad's uncle had been put on the throne, but man, he did not know what to do. Enter Sukra, a minister to the former Shah and leader of a powerful noble family. He took command of the army and managed to stop the Hephthalite advance.
Like I said, the Hephthalites are advancing pretty far west. As I mentioned, when you see images, maps of the Sassanid Empire at its fullest extent, it holds a lot of the territory that the Hephthalites are currently inhabiting. So this is a, pretty powerful kingdom right here.
Sukra then negotiated the terms of a new truce, agreeing to pay a heavy tribute in exchange for peace and the return of all Iranian property, including the dead Shah's son, Kavad. Sukra returned home a hero. People celebrated him in the streets. But Kavad wasn't so lucky. Though he was the previous Shah's son, the noble families of Iran decided to elect Kavad's uncle as the new Shah. After all, how could they trust this boy who had just spent years as a prisoner of the enemy?
Yup, and that's exactly the point I was making. One of the points of taking a royal child, or in this case, the royal heir, as your prisoner, is that hopefully, if you're the Hephthalites, you can make Kavad a lot friendlier to your country and your cause. And clearly, the Iranian nobles knew this and were worried about this, and so they skipped him over. They said, yeah, not gonna happen, Kavad. Also, probably the fact that his father was so unsuccessful didn't help his chances.
One noble even wanted to see Kavad executed, but Sukra, who had just gone to all this trouble rescuing the kid, managed to convince the nobles to merely imprison Kavad instead. So the poor kid got sent away yet again, this time to the Fortress of Oblivion. I am not kidding, that was the prison's actual name. Don't say history never gave you anything. Honestly, Kavad had been better off with the Hephthalites. Sure, he had been their prisoner, but they always treated him like more of a guest. And
well, yeah, and that was sort of the tradition with this, taking of prisoners, right? Now, if you're taking a common person as a prisoner, trust me, they're not going to be treated well, but if you're taking the royal heir of your greatest rival as a prisoner, you're going to treat them well. They're going to be treated as a royal or at least a noble guest at your court. I mean, the whole idea is that when you send them back, they're supposed to like you. So yeah, this imprisonment, while it definitely was imprisonment, Kavad was not free to leave the Hephthalites. It wouldn't have been too bad on him.
And frankly, prisons don't earn names like Fortress of Oblivion for being comfortable. Somehow, though, Kavad managed to escape, and when he did, he ran right back to the Hephthalites. He promised them gold, and in return, they promised to help him win back his rightful throne. Thus, in 488 CE, Kavad marched to the capital at Ctesiphon with a sizable foreign army at his heels. This time, the nobles sided with him, as did Sukra. They deposed his uncle without a fight, and Kavad was confirmed as the new Shah. Sukra became his advisor and tutor, since the new Shah was still pretty young.
So here we have Kavad. He's taken the throne with the help of the Hephthalites. It's an interesting way to do it. It has been done times before. We see examples of young monarchs or aspiring monarchs using their rivals, their supposed enemies, to help them take the throne from somebody else. But, of course, Kavad does also have that royal legitimacy. I mean, his father was on the throne, so he's a lot more legitimate than someone who just came out of nowhere.
And had definitely not spent much time in Iran recently. At first, Kavad welcomed Sukra's advice, but he eventually came to realize that his so-called advisor wanted him as a puppet, not a Shah. When people had problems in need of solving, they always brought those problems to Sukra.
Well, I mean, Sukra's been so influential for a long time. I mean, he's the one who really saved the empire. I don't know if it was necessarily on the verge of collapse, but Kavad's father was really struggling against the Hephthalites. He ended up dying. Sukra was the one who brought it back. Clearly, he's the one who's more trusted. Kavad has been away for most of his life, so it makes sense that even though Kavad is on the throne, he is the Shah, his position is less cemented than Sukra's.
And when Kavad tried to weigh in with his own suggestions, everybody ignored him. he soon realized that the crown he wore and the throne he sat on were mere decoration. Sukra truly ruled this empire. Now, it is true that a handful of noble families had always been the real power behind the throne of Iran. It had been that way for centuries, but they were supposed to stay behind the throne. They each oversaw specific regions on the Shah's behalf, much like feudal lords. And while
Yeah, and we saw this system when we were watching our early Muslim expansion series. As the empire started to break down, a lot of these lords, basically, as they mentioned, similar to feudal lords, their loyalty to the Shah began to quickly disintegrate as the power of the Sassanid throne began to crumble. And so a lot of these lords who had sort of nominal loyalty to the Shah, they started to sort of go their own way when the Muslims started encroaching on the Sassanid Empire and it started to fall apart. So in the long run, this will sort of be a weakness, but this is sort of inevitable in this sort of system. You have a large empire, a lot of people to manage, a lot of territory to control. Unless you can effectively centralize power, which is very difficult to do, extremely difficult in the pre-modern era, then you're probably going to function in a sort of feudal or semi-feudal system like this.
while the locals might serve their noble families, those families were supposed to serve the Shah. It had worked this way for so long that the biggest noble families, like Sukra's, had been in power even longer than the Sasanian dynasty Kavad descended from. And yeah, the nobles had always meddled in royal affairs. Kavad's uncle was not the first Shah they had deposed, and he would not be the last, but the way Sukra was now holding court and giving orders on the Shah's behalf, that was not done. After 5 years of struggling to assert control over his own advisor, Kavad ordered Sukra to leave the capital and go back to his home city.
Alright, I'm curious to see if Sukra is going to take this sitting down. He's accrued so much power. It is the fairly typical trope of the minister or advisor who has a lot of influence. He grows his power over time. He gets a little too big for his britches, and he tries to overtake the position of the king. Now, Sukra hasn't seized the throne at this point. I'm not sure if he will. I don't know where this is going to go, but clearly at this point Kavad is making an attempt to lessen Sukra's influence.
Sukra obeyed, but only because it put him out of the Shah's reach. From such a safe distance, he could brag openly about how Kavad wouldn't even have a throne if not for him. And even living away from the capital, he held all the power. The empire's taxes were still brought to him.
Damn, really? Okay, that is a very high degree of power. I mean, if we're talking about this era of history, if we look at what the government does, tax collection is a massive chunk of government operations. It's extremely important. It's also a way to exert control over your people, though I guess all of that is still true today, honestly. And so the taxes going directly to you, that provides a high degree of power.
He still commanded the army. Kavad had nothing. The stars had aligned for Sukra. To all appearances, he stood on the brink of claiming the throne for himself.
Yep.
This is what Kavad had counted on. If he knew one thing about Iran's noble families, it was this. Through all the centuries of intrigue, manipulation, and outright bloodshed, the one thing that always served to keep noble families in check was their rivalry with other noble families. Now, with Sukra visibly rising to new heights of power, and openly bragging about it no less, his most bitter rivals took action.
Yep, and this is a very effective strategy to keep your power if you're the king of such a system. And we see a lot of kings or emperors using this technique in feudal systems where they have all of these different lords and vassals, and if any one of them gets too powerful, the idea is that the rivalry between these different lords will bring them all back down. Now, there are issues with that. It can make it a little more difficult to effectively organize, but it also means, ideally, that you can keep your position at the top and not be usurped by any one of these particular lords or aristocratic families. That's the idea.
Egged on by Kavad, they gathered and raised their own army to march on Sukra's home. Soon, they deposited both Sukra and his vast treasury at Kavad's feet. The young Shah had eliminated the greatest threat to his reign while barely lifting a finger. Sukra was executed and removed from the board, but Kavad was just getting started. Never again would he allow a noble family to rise against him the way Sukra just had. The nobles must be cut off at the...
All right, I mean, this is some pretty good stuff for a king. I mean, we can look at some of the more powerful kings throughout history. I'm thinking in particular someone like Louis XIV, sort of the archetypical absolute monarch. What did he do? Well, he cemented his position at the top. He made his nobles fight amongst each other for his influence, for his favor, and through that process, he made sure to cement his power and weaken the power of the aristocrats. I mean, this is what or at least most kings and emperors want to do, right? They know that in some ways they have to function through this feudal system of delegating authority to these different local lords. But they want to do that as little as possible because they want all power to flow through them, from the top to the bottom. And so the more power they can get in their own hands, and that power has to be taken from these noble families, the better. And it seems like Kavad is trying to do that, so I'm curious to see how successful he will be. He's pretty successfully defeated Sukra, a big challenge to his throne, so I think he has a good chance.
The knees. See, a new movement had been brewing in Iran ever since the death of Kavad's father. The threat of a Hephthalite invasion had sent a ripple of fear through the empire, and in that atmosphere, people had turned to new faiths with new answers. One priest in particular, named Mazdak, had split from the official tenets of Iran's Zoroastrian religion and begun preaching a new doctrine. Mazdak believed in peace, free love, and eating veggies. He was basically a 5th century hippie. And he'd argued for the complete redistribution of wealth and the peaceful...
And for those that are unaware, I assume a lot of you probably know this if you're into this sort of history. Zoroastrianism was the primary religion of Iran before Islam. Of course, in a couple hundred years from this point, the caliphate will expand into Iran, and Islam will become the predominant religion of Iran and the entire Middle East. But at this point, though we do have, say, Christian influences, Jewish influences, and a lot of other religions, Zoroastrianism is sort of the main state religion of the Persian Empire.
Elimination of entrenched upper-class nobility like Sukra. Kavad liked that last idea very much. So the Shah gave up meat, embraced free love, and became a Mazdakite.
Oh,
With
wow.
Kavad's blessing, Mazdak threw open the imperial granaries and began distributing food to the people. They also divided up land that had been held by the noble families for centuries, weakening noble control of the realm.
Wow. Very interesting. This is a very egalitarian philosophy. I guess it makes sense that it would emerge in the form of a religion in an era when religion is so influential. I mean, if we think back hundreds of years before this, it's kind of the opposite, I think, where, you have a lot of non-religious philosophy, and that's perhaps more influential than a lot of these different pagan religions. But at this point, with Christianity and Judaism and Zoroastrianism, religion is pretty much the main way that people view the world, the lens through which people understand the world. And so it does make sense that a new philosophy like this would emerge through a religion. But it is curious, it's a very egalitarian way of doing things.
For the first time in Kavad's reign, the people loved him. They sang his praises the way they used to sing Sukra's for saving them from the Hephthalites. But both the nobility and the high-ranking priesthood, those powers which had stood behind the throne for centuries, hated him. Kavad had made a mistake. Maybe he thought he could restrain Mazdak's more ambitious ideas about equality. Or maybe he thought that this popularity with the people would keep him safe.
It's always a balancing act. If you're in this position of a monarch, you have to balance the influence you have with your aristocracy and with the people. And I mean, it's great to have a lot of influence with the people, but if you're leaning too heavily on that, you have to worry about what the aristocracy is going to do, because if they get too upset with you, they might lash out. The same thing can be flipped. If you lean too much on your aristocracy and the people absolutely hate you, then you could risk a popular rebellion. Seems like Kavad is kind of ignoring his aristocracy. He's trying to increase his power over them, which, I mean, is a good idea for someone in his position. I mentioned earlier how someone like Louis XIV did it, but you have to be very careful. There's a lot of pitfalls.
But he had reached too far, too fast.
Uh-oh.
The nobles rose up against him, deposed him, and once again threw him into the Fortress of Oblivion.
Damn, he's back!
Boy, I love that name. They then put his younger brother on the throne to undo Mazdek's reforms and be their new puppet Shah. Alas, though the Fortress of Oblivion continued to have a very, very cool name, it also continued to be very, very bad at containing Kavads.
Yeah, why does it have such an epic name if Kavad can manage to escape so quickly? I mean, honestly, this time is less surprising. I mean, he was/is the Shah. He has an incredible amount of influence. I was more surprised the first time he escaped.
Kavad escaped once again and fled to his old friends, the Hephthalites.
Oh,
I think
wow.
it might be time to face the hard truth that the Fortress of Oblivion was just not a very good prison.
No, clearly not. Also, clearly, the Hephthalites' imprisonment of Kavad and their education of him and bringing him up clearly had the intended effect. He's clearly friendly to them, and whenever he has a problem, he goes right back to them.
Yes, I am disappointed too. The Hephthalites were just as happy to accept Kavad's money as last time, though. So once again, he boldly...
Of course they are. I mean, he's friendly to them. He's basically a Hephthalite ally. And whenever he has a problem, he comes back to them with a big bag of money. This is a great deal for the Hephthalites. It does mean that, they sort of have to halt their expansion westwards, but they have an important ally, and they're getting pretty rich off of this whole business.
marched up to Ctesiphon. His poor brother, who had never really been that into this whole Shah idea anyway, quickly stepped aside, and for the second time, Kavad became the Shah of Iran.
Wow.
But it's fair to say at this point that Kavad's reign had thus far been troubled.
Oh yes, Kavad has had a very volatile reign and a very volatile life. He has definitely struggled to keep a steady position for sort of an extended period of time. Seems like, one, he's just been put into a lot of bad circumstances. Two, perhaps he was a little too ambitious. They didn't go into too much detail on how he angered the nobles, but I get the impression that maybe he was too ambitious with trying to centralize power in his own hands.
One disaster after another, really. And all of these upheavals had left the empire weak. The army was still under the fractured control of the noble families, and Iran's wealth was being sapped away year after year in costly tributes to appease the Hephthalites.
Yep.
And to top it off, Mazdek and his followers continued to push their aggressive social reforms forward, even after Kavad had tried to tone down his support of their ideals. Things did not look good for the K-Man, but he was undeterred. Kavad believed he could bring his empire back from the brink of ruin, but it would take a lifetime, perhaps even 2 lifetimes. Luckily, he might just have 2 lifetimes to work with. Just before he had been deposed, a new wife had given birth to his 3rd son. The boy was young, but Kavad saw potential in him. This child could be molded to carry on the legacy that Kavad now hoped to build. That boy's name was Khosrau.
There we go. We finally got to Khosrau, by the way. I almost forgot that this was a series on Khosrau because this whole first episode was on Kavad. And fair enough, hey, we need the necessary backstory. I'm interested to get some context. And I learned about the reign of Kavad so far. Seems like we've still got more to go. Whereas I knew nothing about him before this video. I'll be excited to continue Kavad's reign, and then finally get to Khosrau, which is who I'm really interested in. But it seems like Khosrau's father was quite the character too. So yeah, I enjoyed this one. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe. Once again, if you're interested in exclusive content, please check out the Patreon or channel memberships. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.